I still remember the weight of my backpack as I stepped off the Greyhound bus in Thornwood, West Virginia, population 437 according to the faded sign at the town limits. The August heat pressed down on the valley like a wool blanket, but something about the shadows between those ancient mountains felt cold, as if sunlight had never quite reached certain hollows in all the millennia they'd stood watch over Appalachia. My name is Julian Cross, and I'd come to these mountains as a wildlife researcher studying black bear migration patterns. Fresh out of graduate school with my ecology degree and enough student debt to make me nauseous, I'd jumped at this 6-month field position with the Appalachian Wildlife Conservancy. The pay was modest, but the opportunity to conduct independent research in one of the least studied wilderness areas in the eastern United States was exactly what my career needed. What I didn't know then, standing in that dusty parking lot with my equipment cases and naive optimism, was that I would encounter something in those ancient hills that would shatter everything I thought I understood about the natural world. The town itself looked like it had been exhaled by the mountains themselves sometime around 1952 and then forgotten. A single main street featured a general store, a post office that doubled as a diner, and a weathered church with a steeple that listed slightly to the left. Pickup trucks from the 1982nd and 92nd lined the street, and the few locals I saw watching me from porches and doorways had the wary, the measuring look of people who'd learned that strangers rarely brought good news to isolated places like this. I'd arranged to meet my local guide at the general store, a man named Silas McKenna, who supposedly knew the high country better than anyone. The Conservancy had insisted I hire someone familiar with the terrain, and after reading accounts of researchers getting lost for days in the labyrinthine hollows and ridges of this region, I'd agreed without argument. The store's interior was dim and cool, smelling of old wood, coffee, and something vaguely medicinal I couldn't identify. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes, pale blue and sharp as glass, studied me with an intensity that made me want to check if I'd forgotten to zip my fly. "You'd be the bear man," she said. It wasn't a question. "Julian Cross," I said, extending my hand. "I'm here to meet Silas McKenna." She didn't take my hand. Instead, she glanced toward the back of the store, where a figure sat in the shadows. "Silas, your city boy's here." The man who unfolded himself from a chair in the corner was not what I'd expected. Silas McKenna looked to be in his early 50s, lean and weathered like driftwood, with a face that seemed to be made of hard angles and old scars. His eyes were dark, almost black, and when they fixed on me, I felt like I was being assessed by something wild that was deciding whether I was predator, prey, or something too pathetic to bother with. "You know how to shoot?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "I've had firearms training for wildlife work," I said, which was true. I could handle a rifle well enough to put down an injured animal if necessary, though the thought made me sick. "That ain't what I asked." "I can shoot," I said, meeting his gaze. He studied me for another long moment, then gave a slight nod. "We leave at first light. You'll need proper boots, not those." He gestured dismissively at my expensive hiking boots. "Eleanor here can set you up. Bring whatever fancy equipment you got for tracking your bears, but keep it light. Where we're going, every ounce matters." "How far into the backcountry are we talking?" "Far enough that if something happens, it'll be days before anyone could reach us. Far enough that cell phones don't work and compasses get confused. Far enough that the maps don't match the ground anymore, assuming the maps ever got it right in the first place." He moved toward the door with the easy, economical grace of someone who spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. "There's a boarding house 2 doors down, Mrs. Patterson's place. Tell her I sent you. Be at the trailhead on Hickory Ridge Road at 6 a.m. sharp. If you're not there, I leave without you." He was gone before I could ask any follow-up questions. Eleanor, the woman behind the counter, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Don't mind Silas. He don't trust easy, especially not government folks or college types. Lost his brother to these mountains 20 years back. Search and rescue never found so much as a bootlace." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "Sorry, don't bring nobody back." She pulled out a box of heavy-duty hiking boots. "What size are you?" As she fitted me with boots that felt more like medieval armor than modern footwear, I noticed a map on the wall behind the counter. It showed the surrounding wilderness, but someone had drawn additional markings on it in red ink. Certain areas were circled, some marked with X's, others with what looked like dates. "What are those markings for?" I asked. Eleanor's hands paused in their work. When she looked up at me, something in her expression had shifted. becoming even more guarded. Places folks have gone missing, places where hunters found things they couldn't explain, places where the forest don't act right. Don't act right, how? She handed me the boots. You'll need wool, socks, 2 pair, waterproof matches, even though you probably got one of them fancy lighters, paracord, 50 feet minimum. And this. She placed a small object on the counter. It was a whistle, old and tarnished, hanging from a leather cord. In case I get separated from Silas, in case you need to make noise, she said. There's things in the high country that'll leave you alone if they know you're there. It's the ones that stalk quiet as shadow you gotta worry about. She paused, seeming to debate something with herself. Your bear tracking, that'll take you up near the old growth stands, won't it? The forest that's never been cut? That's where the Conservancy thinks there's a previously undocumented migration corridor. Eleanor's mouth became a thin line. Listen to Silas when you're up there. He knows what he knows, even if he don't talk about why he knows it. And if he says we're leaving an area, you don't ask questions. You don't pack up your equipment nice and neat. You move. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine despite the afternoon heat. Has something been attacking people up there? Nothing so simple as an attack, she said quietly. But people change when they go into the deepest parts of the old forest. They come back different, if they come back at all. And sometimes, what comes back ain't quite the same thing that went in. I wanted to dismiss her words as superstitious mountain folklore, the kind of stories isolated communities tell to make sense of the genuine dangers of wilderness, the tragic accidents that claim lives. But something in her eyes, a kind of weary certainty, made me hesitate. What exactly are you warning me about? She began tallying up my purchases, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at me, she said, when you're up there in the old growth, you might hear things that sound like people calling for help. You might see lights moving between the trees at night, like lanterns, even though there's no trails where they're moving. You might find tracks that look almost human, but wrong in ways that'll make your skin crawl. And if you're real unlucky, you might catch sight of something tall and dark watching you from the tree line. You're talking about Bigfoot, I said, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Sasquatch. I'm talking about something that's been in these mountains since before my grandmother's grandmother was born. Something that the old Cherokee had stories about. Stories that'll freeze your blood if you hear them told proper. And I'm talking about the fact that in the last 50 years, 17 people have vanished without trace in the area you're heading into. 17 that we know about. She finally met my eyes again. You seem like a decent young man, so I'm telling you plain. Be careful up there. Watch what you say and where you say it. Don't go wandering off alone, especially not at dusk or dawn. And if you see something that don't make sense, something that feels wrong in your gut, you trust that feeling. I paid for my supplies, the weight of her warning settling over me like a physical thing. As I loaded my purchases into my backpack, I noticed a bulletin board near the door covered in missing person flyers, some of them yellowed with age. The faces staring out from those flyers ranged from teenagers to experienced hunters, from locals who'd known these mountains all their lives to tourists who'd thought a scenic hike would be a memorable vacation activity. One flyer in particular caught my attention. It showed a young man, maybe mid-20s, with kind eyes and an easy smile. The heading read, Missing, Thomas McKenna, last seen the 15th of July, 2005, Hickory Ridge Wilderness Area. The resemblance to Silas was unmistakable. That's why he keeps going back, Eleanor said quietly from behind me. Near 20 years now, he's been searching those hills, knows every trail, every hollow, every place a man might fall or get turned around. Never found a trace, but he never stops looking. I spent that night at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, lying awake in a room that smelled of mothballs and lavender, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Through my window, I could see the dark bulk of the mountains rising against the stars, and I wondered what I was really walking into tomorrow. My research equipment suddenly seemed inadequate, as if I'd brought a notebook and pencil to defuse a bomb. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of vast forests where the trees grew so close together that the spaces between them formed corridors, pathways that led deeper and deeper into green darkness. In the dream, something moved parallel to me through those corridors, keeping pace, never quite visible but always present. I could hear it breathing, slow and measured, and I knew with dream certainty that it had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to venture into its domain. The sky was still more dark than light when I arrived at the trailhead on Hickory Ridge Road. Silas was already there, leaning against a battered Ford pickup that looked older than I was. He gave my gear a critical once-over, then nodded fractionally, which I took as approval. "You carrying?" he asked. I patted the holster at my hip where I'd secured my research pistol, a .45 caliber sidearm I'd qualified with but hoped never to use. "I am." "Good. Keep it accessible." He shouldered his own pack, which looked like it had survived several wars. "We're heading up the northeast face, following Little Creek until we hit the old growth boundary. That's about 8 miles. Then we head into the deep forest for another 6. There's a clearing there with a spring, good campsite. We'll set up base and you can start your survey work from there." "How far have you personally traveled into this area?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "Far enough." We started up the trail as the sun began its slow climb over the ridgeline. The path was well maintained at first, clearly used regularly by hunters and hikers. But as we climbed higher, the forest began to change. The mixed hardwoods of the lower elevation gave way to denser stands of hemlock and pine, and the quality of light shifted, becoming greener, more filtered, as if we were descending underwater rather than climbing a mountain. Silas moved with the efficiency of someone who'd walked these paths so many times they'd become part of his internal map. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always relevant information about the terrain, water sources, or potential hazards. I found myself studying him, wondering about the brother he'd lost, about what drove a man to spend 20 years searching for something he must know. Rationally, he would never find. Around mid-morning, we stopped for water at a creek that tumbled down over moss-covered rocks. I was unpacking my first round of survey equipment, preparing to set up a game camera, when Silas suddenly went very still. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. I listened. Birds called in the canopy above us. The creek burbled. Somewhere distant, a woodpecker hammered at a tree. "Hear what?" "Exactly." He was scanning the tree line with an intensity that made my scalp prickle. Birds stopped singing on the ridge above us. "Something's moving up there." I strained to hear, and gradually I realized he was right. The section of forest above us, maybe 100 yards up the slope, had gone silent. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, nothing but the ambient sound of wind in the branches. "Bear?" I suggested. "Maybe," but his tone suggested he didn't think so. "How close you need to be to set up that camera?" I was going to mount it on that hemlock there, about 15 feet up. Should give me a good view of the game trail. "Make it quick." I did, conscious of Silas standing watch while I worked, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle slung across his chest. The silence above us persisted, a bubble of quiet that seemed to move slowly along the ridgeline, paralleling our position. When I finished securing the camera and programming its sensors, I packed up quickly, suddenly eager to keep moving. We continued up the trail, but now I found myself constantly glancing at the slope above us, searching for whatever had spooked the birds. Once, I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting between trees, but when I looked directly at it, there was nothing but forest. "Silas," I said quietly, "what do you think it is?" "Don't know, but something's keeping pace with us. Been doing it for the last half mile." My hand drifted toward my holster. "Should we be worried?" "We should be aware," he corrected. "Difference between those two things might keep you alive up here." By early afternoon, we reached the boundary of the old-growth forest. The change was dramatic and immediate. One moment we were walking through typical Appalachian woodland, trees maybe 60 or 80 years old, decent-sized but with the kind of uniform spacing that spoke of previous logging. Then we crossed an invisible line and entered a different world entirely. The trees here were giants, hemlocks and tulip poplars that soared up 200 feet or more, their trunks so massive that 3 men holding hands couldn't encircle them. The canopy closed overhead like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral, and the light that filtered through was tinted green and gold, thick as honey. The understory was more open than I'd expected, the dense canopy preventing most ground plants from taking hold. But what grew here had a primordial quality to it, ferns as tall as my chest and moss covering everything in shades of emerald and jade. "Welcome to the deep forest," Silas said. "This stand has never been cut. Trees in here are 500 years old, some of them more. When the loggers came through in the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds, they couldn't get their equipment up here. Too steep, too remote, so it survived." I stood there, overwhelmed by the sheer age and scale of the place. These trees had been growing when Shakespeare was writing his plays, when Columbus sailed to the Americas, when the Roman Empire still held sway over Europe. They'd witnessed centuries of seasons, of storms, of the quiet succession of forest life that played out in their shadows. "It's incredible," I breathed. "It's dangerous," Silas countered. "Easy to get turned around in here. Landmarks don't work the way you expect them to. Valleys fold into each other. What looks like a straight path ends up turning you in circles. He pointed to a massive hemlock ahead. See that tree? Got a split trunk. Very distinctive. Keep track of trees like that. If you see the same distinctive tree twice, you know you're walking in circles. We pushed deeper into the old growth, and I began to understand what he meant. Despite my GPS unit and compass, I found myself getting disoriented. The sameness of the giant trees combined with the filtered light made it difficult to maintain a sense of direction. Several times I could have sworn we'd passed the same spot before, even though Silas insisted we were making steady progress toward our campsite. And then there were the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The old growth was quieter than any forest I'd ever experienced. Our footfalls on the thick carpet of centuries-old leaf litter seemed muffled, absorbed by the ground itself. When wind moved through the canopy far above, it sounded like distant ocean waves, but down where we walked, the air was still and heavy. "It's so quiet," I murmured. "Things are listening," Silas replied, which was exactly the kind of thing I didn't need to hear. We reached the clearing he'd mentioned around 4 in the afternoon. It was a natural opening in the forest, maybe 50 yards across, where a spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks and formed a small pool before trickling away into the trees. The grass here was thick and soft, and the place had an odd quality to it, as if it existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. "We'll camp here," Silas announced. "Get your tent set up on the west side, away from the game trail coming down from the ridge. Spring water's safe to drink, but filter it anyway. I'll get a fire going." As I worked on setting up my tent and organizing my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. It wasn't the obvious prickle of eyes on your back that you get in a crowded place. This was more subtle, like the pressure change before a storm, a sense of presence without any direct evidence of it. The feeling grew stronger as dusk approached. The quality of light in the clearing shifted, the green gold of afternoon giving way to a deeper, more ominous emerald. Shadows stretched out from the tree line, reaching toward our camp like grasping fingers. Silas built the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, and as the flames caught and grew, I felt marginally better. There was something primal about fire, something that spoke to the part of the human brain that still remembered when we were prey animals huddled against the dark. We ate a simple meal of freeze-dried camping food and shared a canteen of coffee that Silas had somehow made palatable despite being brewed over an open fire. As the darkness deepened around us, he finally began to talk. "My brother Thomas was a lot like you," he said, staring into the flames. "Smart, educated, full of ideas about conservation and preservation. He came up here to study the old growth. Wanted to document it before climate change or development destroyed it. Spent a whole summer mapping the forest, taking samples, recording data." He paused, jaw working. "Last time I saw him, he was heading out for a 3-day solo survey of the northwest quadrant. Said he'd found something interesting, wanted to investigate further, but he never came back," I said quietly. "Search and rescue spent 2 weeks combing these mountains, brought in dogs, helicopters, the whole works. Never found anything. No tracks, no abandoned equipment, no trace. It's like the forest just swallowed him whole." He looked up at me, and in the firelight his eyes were haunted. "I've been coming back ever since, every season, every year, searching. Eleanor said people change when they go into the old growth. What did she mean by that?" Silas was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Thomas kept a journal. I found it in his room after he disappeared. The last few entries were strange, talking about feeling watched, about hearing voices in the forest that sounded like people calling for help but couldn't be found. He wrote about tracks he'd found, massive footprints, humanoid but wrong, and in his final entry, he wrote something I've never been able to forget." "What did he write?" He said, "The forest has a guardian, and it's older than we can comprehend. I've seen it watching me from the tree line. Tomorrow I'm going to try to make contact." Silas's voice had gone flat, emotionless. That was 20 years ago tomorrow. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "You think he found what he was looking for?" "I think the forest took him, same as it's taken others, and I think whatever's out there in the dark, it's still watching, still waiting." He stood up, stretching. "We should get some sleep. Dawn comes early, and you'll want to start your survey work. But keep that fire going through the night. Don't let it die down. And if you hear anything unusual, anything at all, wake me." I took the first watch, feeding the fire and trying not to think about Thomas McKenna's final journal entry. The night in the old-growth forest was unlike any darkness I'd experienced. It was absolute, total, a blackness so complete that even my eyes couldn't adjust to it. Beyond the circle of firelight, the world simply ceased to exist. And then, around midnight, I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, a low sound like distant thunder or ocean waves. But as I listened, it resolved into something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my mouth go dry with instinctive terror. It was breathing, slow and deep and massive, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound of lungs, the size of oil, drums drawing in air and releasing it, steady and patient. The breathing of something huge and alive and very close. My hand found my holster, fingers closing around the grip of my pistol. My heart hammered in my chest, adrenaline flooding my system. But I couldn't move, couldn't cry out, couldn't do anything but sit frozen and listen to that terrible, patient breathing in the dark. And then, between one breath and the next, I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight's reach, where the glow faded into absolute darkness, something stood watching me. My mind tried desperately to process what my eyes were seeing, to fit it into categories that made sense, that belonged in the natural world I thought I understood. It failed utterly. The figure was massive, perhaps 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that suggested immense strength. It stood on 2 legs in a posture that was almost human, but there was something wrong about its proportions, something that triggered every prey instinct evolution had hardwired into my brain. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur, but in the flickering firelight I couldn't determine the exact color, only that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But what froze me in place, what made my breath catch in my throat and my grip tighten on my pistol, were its eyes. Even from 20 yards away, I could see them, reflecting the firelight with a dull reddish glow like heated coals. They were intelligent eyes, aware eyes, eyes that assessed and calculated and understood far more than any animal should. We stared at each other across the firelit clearing, predator and prey locked in a moment that stretched and distorted until time seemed to lose all meaning. Some part of my brain was screaming at me to shoot, to run, to wake Silas, to do something, anything, but I remained motionless, held by that ancient gaze like a mouse hypnotized by a serpent. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying me with what I could only interpret as curiosity. Then, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, it raised one massive hand and pressed a finger to where its mouth would be. A gesture so human, so deliberate, that it shattered something fundamental in my understanding of reality. It was telling me to be quiet. The breathing I'd heard stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, an expectant hush that felt like the drawn breath before a scream. And then, moving backwards with that same impossible grace, the creature melted into the darkness and was gone. I sat there, hand still on my pistol, pulse hammering in my ears, trying to process what had just happened. Had I hallucinated? Was this some kind of elaborate survival test Silas had set up? But even as my rational mind grasped for explanations, a deeper part of me, the part that still remembered what it was like to be prey, knew with absolute certainty that what I'd seen was real. "Silas," I whispered, then louder, "Silas." He was out of his tent in seconds, rifle in hand, instantly alert. What happened? There was something out there, at the edge of the firelight. It was watching us. He scanned the darkness, weapon ready, then looked back at me. "Describe it." I did, my words tumbling over each other as I tried to convey the size, the wrongness, the terrible intelligence in those eyes. When I finished, Silas slowly lowered his rifle and sat down beside me, his face unreadable in the firelight. "You saw it," he said quietly. "It wasn't a question. You believe me? I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years, looking for my brother, looking for answers. I've seen tracks that shouldn't exist. I've heard things that don't match any animal I know. And twice, just twice, I've caught glimpses of something moving through the forest, something that walked upright and moved like liquid shadow." He stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the night. "But I've never been close enough to see its face. Never had it stand and stare at me the way you just described. What is it?" The old Cherokee called it Sulkalu, the great lord of the hunt. Other tribes had different names for it. White settlers called it wild man, or devil monkey, or half a dozen other things. These days, people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and scientists say it doesn't exist, that it's just misidentified bears or hoaxes or mass hysteria. He looked at me directly. But the Cherokee knew better. They knew it was real, and they knew it was dangerous, not because it was violent, but because it was intelligent. Because it understood humans, maybe better than we understand ourselves. Why did it just watch me? Why didn't it attack? Because it wasn't hunting you. If it had been, you'd be dead or gone, and I'd have woken up to an empty tent and another mystery to spend the next 20 years trying to solve. He fed more wood to the fire. No, it was evaluating you, trying to understand what you're doing in its territory. And that gesture you described, the finger to the lips, that's something Thomas wrote about in his journal. He said the creature did the same thing to him, like it was trying to communicate, to establish rules. Rules? What kind of rules? Silence, maybe, respect, an understanding that you're in its domain now, that you're here by its sufferance. Silas's expression was grim. Thomas thought he could establish contact, that he could prove these creatures were intelligent, possibly even communicate with them. I think he succeeded, and I think that's why he never came back. The implications of that settled over me like a suffocating blanket. You think it took him? I think he went willingly. I think whatever he learned, whatever he experienced up here in the old growth, changed him fundamentally, made him choose the forest over everything and everyone he'd known before. Pain flickered across Silas's face. That's the real danger of these creatures. Not that they'll kill you, though they certainly could. The danger is that they'll show you something, reveal something, that makes your old life seem hollow and meaningless, that you'll choose to stay in the deep forest, to become part of whatever ancient mystery exists here. That's insane, is it? You've been in these mountains less than a day, and you've already seen something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught. How does that change your understanding of the world? How does it change you? He stood up, scanning the darkness one more time. Get some rest. We'll have another long day tomorrow, and now that it knows you're here, it'll be watching everything you do. But sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent listening to every sound, real or imagined, from the forest around us. The breathing didn't return, but several times I heard what might have been footfalls, heavy and measured, circling our camp at a distance. Branches cracked somewhere in the darkness. Once, I heard what sounded like a low, rumbling vocalization, almost like speech but in no language I'd ever encountered. When dawn finally came, gray and hesitant through the ancient canopy, I crawled out of my tent, exhausted but relieved to have survived the night. Silas already had coffee brewing, and he handed me a tin cup without comment. We drank in silence, both of us scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of our nocturnal visitor. "Check your equipment," Silas said finally. "We're going to do your survey work, same as planned. But we're staying together, no separating for any reason, and we're going to be very, very careful." I retrieved my research pack and began checking my gear. GPS unit, sample collection equipment, binoculars, game cameras, motion sensors. Everything seemed intact, but when I pulled out my handheld radio to check the battery, I noticed something odd. The radio was on. I distinctly remembered turning it off last night to preserve the battery, and the frequency had been changed from the emergency channel I'd set it to, tuned instead to a dead band of static. I was about to mention this to Silas when the static resolved for just a moment into something else. It might have been audio distortion, it might have been atmospheric interference, but for 3 seconds, clear as a bell, a voice came through the radio speaker. It was deep, resonant, and spoke a single word in what might have been Cherokee or might have been something older, something that predated human language entirely. Then the static returned, and the radio went dead despite showing a full battery. "Silas," I said carefully, "I think we need to talk about what we're actually dealing with here." He looked at the radio in my hand, and I saw him swallow hard. "Pack everything up. We're moving to a different location for today's survey work, somewhere more open, where we can see what's coming." We spent the rest of the morning hiking to a ridgetop where the canopy thinned and we had long sight lines in multiple directions. I set up my equipment to monitor a game trail that showed signs of heavy black bear traffic, exactly the kind of data I needed for my research. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every shadow held potential threat. Every rustle of branches made me spin around, hand moving toward my holster. Around noon, we heard something that made us both freeze. It came from down in the valley below our position, echoing up through the trees with a clarity that spoke to the acoustic properties of these ancient hollows. It was a scream, human and full of terror, the sound of someone in mortal danger. "Help!" the voice cried. "Someone help me, please." My instincts demanded I respond, to run toward that cry and render aid. But Silas's hand clamped down on my shoulder with iron strength, holding me in place. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't move. Don't respond. Don't even breathe loud. But someone needs help. That's not someone. That's something." His eyes were fixed on the valley below, scanning the tree line. It's mimicking, testing us. If we go down there, we won't come back. The cries continued for several minutes, growing more desperate, more anguished, more convincing. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to help, to do something, to not be the kind of person who ignores someone in distress. But Silas's grip never wavered, and gradually I understood what he was saying. Whatever was making those sounds knew exactly how humans would respond to a distress call. It was using our compassion, our social instincts, as bait, and down there in the heavy forest where visibility was measured in yards and escape routes were limited, it would have us at complete disadvantage. The screaming stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed felt loaded, expectant, like the forest itself was waiting to see what we would do. Then, from a completely different direction, we heard it again. The same voice, the same words, but now coming from our right instead of below us. "It's moving," I whispered, "circling us. It's trying to hurt us, push us in a direction it wants us to go." Silas finally released my shoulder. "We're going back to camp, now. Stay close, stay alert, and don't respond to anything you hear, no matter how convincing it sounds." The hike back to our clearing felt like it took hours, though my GPS track showed it was barely 45 minutes. Several times we heard sounds designed to lure us off path, a child crying, a woman calling for help, once even what sounded like Thomas McKenna's voice calling his brother's name. Each time, Silas ignored it, kept moving, jaw set and rifle ready. When we finally broke into the clearing where we'd camped, I nearly collapsed with relief, but Silas remained tense, eyes scanning the tree line. "It's playing with us," he said, "showing us what it can do, demonstrating its intelligence." "Why? What does it want?" "I don't know, but we're going to find out, tonight." The afternoon passed with agonizing slowness. I tried to focus on cataloging my data, on maintaining the pretense that this was still a wildlife research expedition, but my hands shook as I typed notes into my laptop. Silas spent the time reinforcing our camp, setting up a perimeter of rope hung with tin cans and other noisemakers that would alert us if anything large tried to approach. As dusk approached, he built up the fire larger than necessary, then set up a second, smaller fire on the opposite side of the clearing. The two fires cast overlapping circles of light that left no shadow gaps for something to hide in. "Tonight we're going to get answers," he said, checking his rifle for the third time, "one way or another." "What makes you think it'll come back?" "Because it's been building to this since we arrived. The watching, the sounds, the games, it's all been leading somewhere." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I think it wants to communicate. Maybe it's been waiting for someone like you, someone educated enough to understand what it's trying to show us. Or maybe it's planning to kill us and has been toying with its food." "That's possible too," he admitted, "which is why we're both staying armed and alert. But I've been searching for Thomas for 20 years. If there's even a chance of learning what happened to him, I have to take it." We ate dinner as the sun set, painting the sky above the canopy in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the dread I felt. As full darkness descended, we positioned ourselves back to back between the two fires, weapons ready, waiting. The forest around us came alive with night sounds, insects, frogs, the occasional call of an owl, normal sounds, the soundtrack of a healthy ecosystem. But underneath it all, I could feel that presence again, that sense of being observed by something vast and patient and utterly alien to human experience. "Tell me about Thomas," I said quietly. "What was he like?" Silas was silent for a long moment. He was younger than me by 4 years, but he always seemed older in the ways that mattered, more thoughtful, more curious about the world. He saw connections between things that other people missed. That's what made him good at his work, understanding how ecosystems functioned as wholes rather than just collections of individual species. His voice softened. He used to say that humans had forgotten how to listen to the forest, that we'd lost something essential when we built our cities and cut ourselves off from the natural world. I thought it was just romantic nonsense. Now I'm not so sure. Eleanor said people who go into the old growth come back changed, if they come back at all. But yeah, I've seen it. Hunters who spend too much time in the deep forest start acting different. They get distant, like they're only partly present in normal conversation. And they keep going back, deeper each time, until eventually they don't come back at all. He shifted position, and I heard the creak of leather as he adjusted his rifle sling. "I think the forest gets inside you somehow. Or maybe it shows you something that makes everything else seem pale and meaningless by comparison." Around 10 o'clock, the normal night sound stopped. The silence that descended was absolute, oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on the clearing. Both fires were burning bright, but suddenly their light seemed inadequate, pushing back the darkness only a few feet before it swallowed everything. "It's here," Silas breathed. I saw it at the same moment, emerging from the tree line on the eastern side of the clearing. In the firelight, I got a much better look than I had the previous night, and what I saw would be burned into my memory forever. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, possibly more. Its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, though hair didn't quite capture the texture, something between fur and what I'd imagine prehistoric humans might have looked like. The musculature was incredible, suggesting strength far beyond anything human, but it was the posture, the way it carried itself, that truly unsettled me. It moved with confidence and purpose, not like an animal but like something that understood exactly what it was doing and why. It stopped at the edge of the firelight, just as it had the previous night, but this time it didn't retreat. Instead, it slowly, deliberately, sat down. The gesture was so human, so casual, that it created a bizarre cognitive dissonance. This was a cryptid, a creature that wasn't supposed to exist, sitting cross-legged like someone settling in for a conversation. "Don't shoot," Silas said quietly, though I could hear the tremor in his voice. "It's not threatening us." The creature's eyes, dark and intelligent, moved between us. Then it reached down and picked up a stick from the ground, about 3 feet long and relatively straight. With movements that were careful and measured, clearly designed to not seem threatening, it began drawing in the dirt between itself and our position. "Is it trying to communicate?" I whispered. "Watch. Just watch." The creature drew a series of symbols in the dirt, using the stick with surprising dexterity. The first symbol looked like a mountain or triangle with a circle at its peak. The second was a stick figure that might have represented a human. The third was a larger figure with exaggerated proportions, clearly meant to represent itself. Then it drew lines connecting all three, forming a triangle with each symbol at one point. "It's showing us something," Silas murmured. "The mountain, humans, and its kind. A relationship, maybe, or a hierarchy." The creature continued drawing, adding more details. It sketched what looked like a forest beneath the mountain, and within the forest, it drew multiple smaller symbols, animals of various kinds. Then it drew a line around all of this, encircling everything. "It's showing us an ecosystem," I said, my research training kicking in despite my fear. The mountain as habitat, the forest as community, different species in relationship. And look, it's placed itself and humans at the same level, not above the other animals but separate from them. The creature paused in its drawing and looked directly at me. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It reached into the mass of hair on its chest and withdrew something, holding it out toward the firelight for us to see. It was a watch. A digital watch, scratched and weathered but still recognizably modern. And on the back, just visible in the firelight, I could see an engraving. Silas made a sound like he'd been punched in the gut. "That's Thomas's watch. I gave it to him for his 21st birthday." The creature held the watch for another moment, then carefully, almost reverently, placed it on the ground between us. Then it went back to its drawing, adding one more element. It drew the stick figure human walking into the forest, showed it meeting the larger figure, and then drew them walking together deeper into the trees. At the end of the path, it drew a circle with rays emanating from it, like a sun or a source of light. "Knowledge," I breathed. "It's offering knowledge, understanding." That's what it showed Thomas. Silas was staring at his brother's watch, his face working through a dozen emotions. Thomas went with it willingly. He chose this. The creature nodded, the gesture unmistakable and deliberate. Then it stood up, and I noticed something I hadn't before. Despite its size and obvious power, it moved with a kind of reverence, a gentleness that suggested deep respect for the forest around it. This wasn't a monster or a mindless beast. This was something ancient and wise, something that understood its place in the world with a clarity that most humans never achieved. It looked at us one more time, and in its eyes I saw something that might have been invitation or might have been warning. Then it gestured to the drawing, to the watch, to the forest behind it. The message was clear. We could choose. We could take this knowledge back to civilization, try to explain what we'd seen, knowing no one would believe us. Or we could follow, could learn what Thomas had learned, could become part of something older and deeper than our modern world understood. "What do we do?" I asked. Silas picked up his brother's watch, turning it over in his hands. His face was wet with tears that reflected the firelight. "We document everything. We take the evidence back. We tell the truth, even if no one believes us," He looked at the creature, and I saw something resolve in his expression. But we don't follow. Thomas made his choice, and I have to respect that. But we're not giving up the world we know for something we don't understand. The creature tilted its head, studying us. Then it reached down and gently erased the drawing in the dirt, smoothing away the symbols until no trace remained. The gesture felt final, like the closing of a door that would never open again. It straightened up, gave us one last long look, and then turned and walked back into the forest. We watched it go, seeing its massive form move between the ancient trees with that same impossible grace, until the darkness swallowed it and we were left alone with our fires and our questions and a watch that proved everything and nothing at once. Neither of us slept that night. We sat together, keeping the fires burning, occasionally talking in quiet voices about what we'd seen, what it meant, what we were going to do. As dawn approached and the forest began to lighten around us, Silas made his decision. We're packing up today, heading back down the mountain. You've got your research data, and I've got my answer about Thomas. This is more than either of us came here looking for. The watch isn't enough proof, I said. No one will believe what we've seen based on that alone. I know, but trying to prove it, trying to lead other people up here to verify what we've witnessed, that feels like a violation. Like we'd be betraying something important. He looked out at the forest, now visible in the gray morning light. The old Cherokee were right to keep their knowledge of these creatures secret. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some corners of the world need to remain wild and unknown. We broke camp efficiently, packing away all evidence of our presence. Before we left, I retrieved the game camera I'd set up on our first day, curious what it might have recorded. When I checked the memory card, I found hundreds of images, most of them showing normal forest scenes, deer and raccoons and other expected wildlife. But there were 3 images, time-stamped from the previous night, that made my breath catch. They showed the creature, clearly visible in the camera's night vision mode, standing at the edge of the clearing, but it wasn't watching our camp. It was looking directly at the camera, as if it knew exactly where it was and what it was for. And in its eyes, enhanced by the camera's infrared illumination, there was something that looked almost like sadness, or perhaps disappointment. In the last image, it had moved closer to the camera, so close that only its torso and part of its face were visible. And there, on its chest, just barely visible through the hair, were markings, symbols that looked similar to what it had drawn in the dirt. Ancient writing, or perhaps a language beyond human comprehension, preserved on the body of something that had walked these mountains since before recorded history. I showed the images to Silas. He studied them for a long time, then nodded. Keep them, but don't share them widely. Some things are too important to turn into spectacle. The hike back down the mountain felt different than the ascent. The forest seemed to watch us go, not threatening but evaluating, measuring what we carried away with us in terms of knowledge and responsibility. We reached the trailhead by late afternoon, exhausted and forever changed by what we'd experienced. In the weeks that followed, I completed my research project and submitted my findings on black bear migration patterns. The paper was well received, added another line to my curriculum vitae, advanced my career in the small, incremental ways that academic success is measured. But none of it felt particularly important anymore. Silas kept his brother's watch, wearing it every day. He stopped making his annual searches of the high country, no longer driven by the need to find answers. Thomas had made his choice, had walked into something vast and mysterious and ancient, and that was enough. I still have the game camera images, stored on an encrypted drive, never shared with anyone. Sometimes I look at them late at night, studying those symbols, those eyes that held such profound intelligence, and I wonder what Thomas learned in the deep forest. What knowledge was offered to him that made him choose to leave everything behind? The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets well. In the old-growth forests, in the deep hollows where humans rarely venture, something ancient and wise continues its patient watch. It knows things we've forgotten, understands connections we've lost, exists in harmony with a world we barely comprehend, and occasionally, to those who venture far enough into its domain, it offers a choice. Return to civilization with questions that have no satisfactory answers, or stay and learn what it means to truly be part of something greater than yourself. I chose to return. But on difficult days, when the modern world feels hollow and meaningless, when the weight of human society presses down on me like a physical thing, I think about Thomas McKenna. I think about him walking deeper into the ancient forest, following something that walked upright and moved like shadow, pursuing knowledge that transformed him into something more than human, or perhaps something more human than we've allowed ourselves to be. The Watcher in the Pines remains in its cathedral of ancient hemlocks, guardian of mysteries we're perhaps not meant to solve. And I carry its images, its gesture of silence, its offer of understanding, as both burden and blessing, a reminder that for all our scientific advancement and technological progress, there are still corners of the world and of existence that remain beautifully, terrifyingly, essentially wild. Some questions are more important than their answers. Some encounters change you in ways that can never be undone, and some nights, when the wind sounds like distant breathing and shadows move at the edge of vision, I remember sitting between two fires while something impossible drew pictures in the dirt, trying to explain what it means to truly belong to the wild places of the world. The mountains keep their secrets, the forest keeps its guardians, and I keep my silence, having learned what Thomas learned before me. Some truths are too profound for words, too important to reduce to mere proof. They can only be experienced, accepted, and carried forward as sacred knowledge in a world that has forgotten how to listen to what the wilderness is trying to tell us. The map dissolved into pulp between my trembling fingers as another wave of freezing rain hammered down through the bare October canopy. I'd been hiking for 6 hours, and nothing looked familiar anymore. The trail markers I'd been following, faded blue blazes painted on scarred tree trunks, had simply stopped appearing about 2 miles back, as if whoever had marked this path had decided the route wasn't worth completing. My name is Marcus, and I'd come to the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia for what was supposed to be a simple 3-day backpacking trip. Simple. The word felt laughable now as I stood in a hollow between two ridges, surrounded by mountains that rose like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. The tourist pamphlets back in town had promised pristine wilderness and unparalleled solitude. They'd delivered on both counts, though not in any way I'd imagined. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since noon, and my breath formed thick clouds that hung in the air like accusations. I should have turned back hours ago when the weather shifted, when those first ominous clouds rolled over the peaks like a dawn advancing army. But I'd convinced myself I was close to the shelter marked on my map, that pushing forward made more sense than retreating. Pride and stupidity often wear the same face in the wilderness. The forest around me felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The trees grew too close together here, their branches interlocking overhead in a claustrophobic weave that blocked what little daylight remained. Thick moss carpeted everything: rocks, fallen logs, even climbing up the trunks of living trees in furry green sheets. The silence pressed against my eardrums with physical weight. No birds called. No squirrels rustled through the undergrowth. Even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the soft forest floor before the noise could travel more than a few feet. I pulled my rain jacket tighter and tried to get my bearings. The hollow I'd descended into was deeper than I'd realized, a natural bowl carved between ridges that rose at least 500 feet on either side. Water ran everywhere down here, forming dozens of tiny streams that merged and split and merged again, creating a maze of slick rocks and sucking mud. The air smelled of decomposition and wet stone, that peculiar odor of places where sunlight rarely reaches and things rot slowly in the perpetual damp. My phone had lost signal that morning and now served only as an expensive flashlight with a rapidly draining battery. The GPS showed my location as a blue dot floating in a sea of green, miles from the nearest marked trail. The app insisted I was still in Monongahela National Forest, but the name offered no comfort. The forest comprised over 900,000 acres of unbroken wilderness. A person could disappear out here and never be found. As I sloshed through another icy stream, my boot caught on a submerged root and I went down hard on one knee. Pain shot through my leg and I cursed, loud and sharp. The sound echoed strangely in the hollow, bouncing between the ridges before fading into something that almost sounded like laughter. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the whisper of rain and the gurgle of moving water. I hauled myself up and tested the knee, tender but functional. My pants were soaked through now, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Hypothermia was a real possibility if I didn't find shelter soon. I scanned the darkening forest, looking for anything that might serve: an overhanging rock, a dense thicket, even a fallen tree I could crawl under. That's when I saw the cabin. It materialized from the gloom about 50 yards ahead, so perfectly camouflaged by the surrounding forest that I almost missed it entirely. The structure was small, maybe 20 feet on a side, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to the same gray-brown as the tree trunks around it. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a narrow porch sagged across the front. No light showed in the single window, and the whole place had an air of abandonment that was somehow both inviting and unsettling. I approached cautiously, my boots squelching in the mud. The cabin sat in a small clearing, though clearing was a generous term for the slightly less dense ring of trees surrounding the structure. Deadfall and brambles choked the space between the building and the forest edge. The porch steps groaned under my weight but held. The door was closed but not locked. The latch was a simple iron hook that lifted easily. I hesitated for just a moment, weighing the ethics of entering someone's property uninvited against the very real danger of spending the night exposed to the elements. Survival won. The interior was a single room, dark and musty but blessedly dry. Gray light filtered through the grimy window, revealing a space that looked frozen in time. A cast-iron stove squatted in one corner, an old cot with a rotting mattress against the far wall. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined one wall, holding an assortment of rusted cans and glass jars whose contents had long since turned to black sludge. I set my pack down and immediately began working on getting warm. The stove looked functional, and someone had thoughtfully left a pile of split wood stacked beside it. Within 20 minutes I had a fire crackling behind the stove's iron door, orange light dancing through the gaps around the grate. I stripped off my wet clothes and draped them over the chairs to dry, then wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and huddled close to the heat. The warmth felt like a miracle. I could feel sensation returning to my fingers and toes in painful tingles. I pulled out my camp stove and heated water for instant soup, sipping the scalding broth and feeling more human with each swallow. The cabin creaked and settled around me as the temperature differential between inside and out increased. Old buildings make noise. I told myself that repeatedly. As night fell completely, the darkness beyond the window became absolute, the kind of darkness that exists only in wilderness far from any human light source. I could see my own reflection in the glass, a pale ghost hovering in the black, and nothing beyond. The fire popped and hissed in the stove. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof. I was exhausted, my body aching from the long day of hiking and the cold, wet conditions. I should have felt safe, or at least safer than I would have been outside. But something nagged at me, a persistent unease that the warmth and shelter couldn't quite dispel. Maybe it was just the strangeness of the situation, the unexpected refuge appearing exactly when I needed it. Or maybe it was something else, some instinct older than reason that recognized danger even in apparent sanctuary. I was contemplating these thoughts, my eyelids growing heavy, when I heard the sound outside, a branch snapping, close to the cabin, maybe just beyond the clearing. I sat up straight, suddenly alert. Animals moved through the forest all the time, deer, bear, wild boar. A large animal could easily break a branch, but something about this sound felt different. It was too deliberate, too singular. One sharp crack, and then silence. I waited, barely breathing, straining my ears. Nothing. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The rain fell. I was beginning to think I'd imagined it when I heard something else. Footsteps, not the 4-footed gallop of a deer or the heavy shuffle of a bear. These were bipedal footsteps, a 2-beat rhythm that moved along the perimeter of the clearing, slow and measured, as if whatever made them was in no hurry, as if it had all the time in the world. I crept to the window and peered out, cupping my hands around my face to block the firelight behind me. The darkness was impenetrable. I could see nothing beyond the reflection of my own wide eyes staring back at me, but I could still hear those footsteps, circling slowly, methodically. They stopped directly in front of the cabin. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I stood frozen at the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Long seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the rain and the fire and my own ragged breathing. Then, from right outside the door, I heard it speak. The voice was wrong. That was the only way to describe it. Human words formed by something that wasn't human, the vowels stretched too long and the consonants clicking in ways no human throat should produce. It spoke in a language I didn't recognize, a string of harsh syllables that raised the hair on my arms and the back of my neck. When it finished speaking, it knocked on the door. 3 slow, measured knocks that shook the frame. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my pack. Every instinct screamed at me to remain silent, to pretend the cabin was empty. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on, instead gripping it like a club. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Then, horribly, the latch began to lift. The iron hook scraped upward with agonizing slowness, metal grinding against metal. I backed toward the far wall, my eyes fixed on that moving latch, my mind racing through impossibilities. I'd hooked it when I came in. I was certain I'd hooked it, yet it was rising, lifting by degrees, as if something outside was working it with patient, deliberate care. The latch reached the top of its arc and stopped. The door remained closed, but the hook now hung freely, no longer securing the entrance. For several seconds nothing happened. The rain continued its assault on the roof. The fire popped, and I stood frozen, waiting for whatever came next. The door swung open slowly, revealing a rectangle of absolute darkness beyond. No moonlight, no stars, the storm clouds blocked everything. For a long moment, that darkness just hung there, framed by the doorway, and I couldn't see what had opened it. Then a shape moved into the threshold, and my breath caught in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall. It had to duck to fit through the doorway, and even bent over it stood at least 7 feet. The figure was humanoid in basic structure, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso and head, but everything about it was wrong. Too thin, too angular, limbs that seemed to have too many joints. In the dim firelight filtering past me, I caught glimpses of dark, matted hair covering most of its body, and beneath that, gray skin stretched tight over prominent bones. But it was the face that paralyzed me with primal terror. The skull was elongated, the jaw too wide, filled with teeth that caught the firelight when it opened its mouth. The eyes were the worst, large and round and reflective, catching the light like a deer's eyes on a dark road, but filled with an intelligence that no animal possessed. Those eyes fixed on me with predatory focus, and I felt like a mouse, suddenly aware it's been spotted by a hawk. The thing took a step inside, and the floorboards creaked under its weight. It moved with an odd, jerky gait, as if its joints bent at slightly wrong angles. The smell hit me, then a reek of rot and old meat and something else, something wild and sharp that made my stomach turn. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please, I didn't mean to. This isn't my cabin. I was just—" It made a sound, a low rumbling that came from deep in its chest. Not a growl exactly, but not words either. It tilted its head to one side, studying me the way a curious child might examine an insect. One long arm reached out, fingers ending in yellowed claws that clicked together as it flexed them. I pressed myself harder against the wall, the rough logs digging into my back. My mind gibbered uselessly, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with any kind of reality I understood. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist, yet it stood there, solid and undeniable, blocking the only exit. The creature took another step forward, then paused. Its head swiveled toward the stove where my wet clothes steamed on the chairs. It approached them with sudden interest, bending to sniff at my jacket. The movement was so unexpectedly mundane, an animal investigating an unfamiliar scent, that I almost laughed. The sound died in my throat when it picked up my jacket with those clawed hands and brought it to its face, inhaling deeply. When it lowered the jacket, it turned those terrible eyes back to me. It made the rumbling sound again, louder this time, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was trying to communicate, not with words, but with something else. Intent, purpose, hunger. It dropped my jacket and took another step toward me. I grabbed the chair nearest me and held it out like a lion tamer, though I knew instinctively it would do nothing against this thing. The creature stopped, head cocked again, as if amused by the gesture. Then it reached out with one impossibly long arm and pushed the chair aside with casual ease. The piece of furniture skidded across the floor and hit the wall with a crash. I was out of room and out of options. The thing stood between me and the door. The window behind me was too small to crawl through, even if I could break the glass before it reached me. My knife was in my pack, which might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me now. The creature reached for me, those clawed fingers spreading wide, and I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. Not words, just a raw sound of terror that ripped from my throat and filled the cabin. The creature jerked back slightly, those reflective eyes widening. For a moment we both froze, me with my mouth open in a silent continuation of the scream, the creature with its arms still extended between us. Then, from somewhere outside in the darkness, another sound answered. A howl, high-pitched and wavering, that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The creature's head snapped toward the door. It made a strange clicking sound, almost like alarm, and took a step backward. The howling came again, closer this time, and definitely from multiple sources. The thing in the cabin seemed to gather itself, its whole body tensing. It looked back at me one more time, and in those eyes I saw something I hadn't expected, not just hunger or curiosity, but recognition, as if it knew me, or knew what I was, in some fundamental way. Then it turned and fled through the open door with shocking speed, disappearing into the darkness in seconds. I stumbled forward and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the latch with shaking hands. It took 3 tries to get the hook set properly. When it finally caught, I sagged against the door, my legs suddenly unable to hold my weight. I slid to the floor and sat there, back pressed to the wood, trying to understand what had just happened. The howling continued outside, moving in patterns around the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but always multiple voices calling to each other in the darkness. Whatever had driven that thing away was still out there, and from the sound of it, there were several of them. I forced myself to move, crawling on hands and knees to my pack. I pulled out my knife and flashlight, pathetic weapons against what I'd just seen, but better than nothing. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip them. The adrenaline that had flooded my system during the encounter was draining away, leaving me weak and nauseous. Hours passed. The howling eventually faded into the distance, though I couldn't be sure it had stopped entirely or just moved beyond hearing. The fire in the stove burned down to embers, and I didn't dare open it to add more wood. I sat with my back to the wall where I could see both the door and the window, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, and waited for dawn. As the first gray light of morning began to seep through the window, I finally allowed myself to believe I might survive until sunrise. My body ached from sitting rigid for so many hours. My mind felt scoured, unable to process what I'd witnessed. Every rational explanation I tried to construct hallucination from hypothermia, a vivid dream, some kind of elaborate prank shattered against the undeniable memory of those eyes and that smell and those clicking claws. When the cabin was light enough to see clearly, I approached the door with extreme caution. I listened for several minutes before working up the courage to lift the latch. My hands were still shaking. The hook scraped up and I pushed the door open a crack, peering through the gap at the clearing beyond. Morning mist hung between the trees in ragged sheets. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and glistening. I could see the muddy ground in front of the cabin clearly, and what I saw there made my stomach drop. Tracks. Large, humanoid tracks pressed deep into the mud, the toes ending in distinct claw marks. They came from the forest edge, circled the cabin multiple times, then led up to the door where they churned the mud in front of the threshold. I could see where the thing had stood, could see the depth of the impressions that suggested enormous weight. But that wasn't what made me feel sick. Surrounding those tracks, overlapping them in places, were other prints. Dozens of them, smaller but similar in shape, with that same unsettling mix of human and animal characteristics. Whatever had howled in the night had left its own evidence, a record of how they'd surrounded the cabin, trapping the first creature or perhaps trapping both of us in some kind of standoff I didn't understand. I grabbed my pack, stuffing my still damp clothes inside without bothering to put them on. I couldn't stay here. Whatever those things were, they knew about this cabin, and they would come back. The morning light gave me my first real view of the surrounding terrain, and I could see a ridgeline to the east that looked familiar from my map. If I could reach it, I could orient myself and find my way back to marked trails. I stepped out onto the porch, and that's when I noticed the scratches. Long, deep gouges carved into the wood of the doorframe, recent enough that white wood showed beneath the weathered gray surface. They were at head height, my head height, and spaced exactly like fingers. 4 parallel lines with a thumb mark off to the side. Something had stood here and clawed at the frame while I huddled inside. The marks ran deep, cutting through an inch of solid wood. I touched one of the grooves, feeling how smooth the wood was inside, polished by whatever had made it. I ran, not the measured pace of a hiker covering ground, but a panicked sprint across the clearing and into the forest. Branches whipped at my face and my pack bounced painfully against my back. But I didn't slow until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Only then did I stop, gasping for breath, and look back the way I'd come. The cabin was lost from view, swallowed by the density of the forest. Everything looked the same in every direction, trees and more trees, the land rising and falling in confusing patterns. I had no idea if I was heading toward the ridge I'd seen or deeper into the wilderness. The panic that had driven my flight began to transform into something colder and more dangerous. I was lost, truly lost now, having abandoned my only landmark in blind fear. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal, but the GPS showed my position. I was farther from any trail than I'd been yesterday, and my flight from the cabin had taken me in the wrong direction, away from the ridge. To reach safety, I would have to cross miles of untracked wilderness, including at least one mountain ridge. The alternative was to go back to the cabin and try to retrace my steps from there. But I couldn't. Even thinking about approaching that place again made my pulse race and my palms sweat. Whatever those things were, the cabin was their territory. I would take my chances in the wilderness. I chose a direction based on the compass in my phone and started walking. The forest seemed different in daylight, less oppressive but still deeply wrong in ways I noticed more clearly now. Trees grew in strange patterns, all leaning slightly in one direction, as if bent by a prevailing wind, yet the wind in these hollows barely stirred the leaves. I passed patches of ground where nothing grew at all, just bare dirt in perfect circles, and other spots where the vegetation was so thick it formed nearly impenetrable walls. The morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, though I rarely saw it directly through the canopy. The mist burned off, leaving the forest steaming gently in the humid air. My shirt clung to my back with sweat despite the cool temperature. I kept walking, stopping only to check my phone and adjust my bearing. Around noon, I found the remains. The smell reached me first, a thick reek of decay that grew stronger with each step. I'd been following a game trail that paralleled a steep-sided creek, grateful for the relatively clear path, when the odor hit me like a physical force. My first instinct was to turn around, to find another route, but something drew me forward. Morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the desperate hope that where there were remains, there might also be other people, hunters or hikers, who could help me find my way out. The creek bed widened into a natural amphitheater where a rock slide had cleared the trees decades ago. Boulders the size of cars lay tumbled in chaotic piles, and in the spaces between them, I saw bones. Not just one skeleton or even a few. Dozens, maybe hundreds of bones scattered across the clearing in varying states of decay. Skulls, mostly deer and bear from what I could identify, were arranged in loose groupings, as if sorted by some alien logic. Rib cages lay split open, the bones picked clean and white. Leg bones stood upright in the ground like fence posts, creating rough perimeters around different sections of the clearing. I stood at the edge of this charnel ground, my hand clamped over my nose and mouth, trying to breathe shallowly. This wasn't natural predation. No bear or pack of wolves did this. The arrangement of the bones suggested intentionality, purpose. This was a feeding ground, yes, but also something else. A display, a territory marker, a warning. I should have turned back immediately. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to retreat, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this place. But I was paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing, unable to look away from the methodical horror laid out before me. That's when I saw the backpack. It hung from a low branch at the far side of the clearing, swaying slightly in the breeze. Bright orange fabric stood out starkly against the muted greens and browns of the forest. The pack was newer than the bones around it, probably not more than a few months old based on how intact it looked. The sight of it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Someone else had been here, recently, and they hadn't left with their gear. I forced myself to move, picking my way carefully between the scattered remains. My boots crunched on smaller bones I couldn't avoid. The sound set my teeth on edge. As I got closer to the pack, I could see it had been torn long rips in the fabric that exposed the contents. A sleeping bag spilled from one tier, and I could see the corner of what looked like a first aid kit. I reached up to pull the pack down, and that's when I heard movement behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. At first, I saw nothing but the clearing full of bones and the forest beyond. Then I caught movement between two large boulders, something gray and hunched, sliding from shadow to shadow with liquid grace. My breath caught. It was one of them. This one was smaller than the creature that had entered the cabin, perhaps only 6 feet tall when it straightened. Its body was cadaverously thin, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed to press against the surface, threatening to break through. Patches of coarse hair covered its shoulders and back, but most of the torso was bare gray flesh that looked almost translucent in the filtered sunlight. The face was a nightmare, an elongated skull with a pushed-in nose and a mouth that split the lower half of the face in a lipless gash filled with pointed teeth. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. They were human eyes, not the reflective, animal eyes of the creature from last night, but eyes that could have belonged to a person, brown and aware and filled with a hunger that was somehow more terrible for its human quality. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those awful eyes. Its nostrils flared as it scented the air. Then it opened that gaping mouth and made a sound, a thin, high-pitched keening that raised every hair on my body. The call hung in the air for a moment, then faded. From multiple points in the forest around the clearing, other voices answered. I ran. There was no thought behind it, no plan, just pure animal panic. I crashed through the undergrowth on the far side of the clearing, away from the creature, away from the answering calls. Branches tore at my clothes and face. My pack snagged on something and I jerked it free without slowing. Behind me, I could hear them coming, multiple pursuers moving through the forest with terrifying speed. The ground sloped sharply upward and I scrambled up it on hands and feet, grabbing roots and rocks for purchase. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. The creatures were calling to each other, their voices forming a pattern I couldn't understand, but that clearly communicated my position. They were herding me, I realized with horror, driving me in a specific direction, working together with pack intelligence. The slope grew steeper, the loose soil giving way beneath my boots. I slid backward several feet before catching myself on a sapling. When I looked up, I saw I'd reached the base of a cliff, a vertical rock face that rose at least 30 feet. To my left and right, the cliff extended as far as I could see. The creatures had driven me into a dead end. I pressed my back against the cold stone and fumbled in my pack for my knife. My hand closed around the handle just as the first creature emerged from the forest below. It was the same one from the clearing, moving with that disturbing, jerky gait. It stopped about 20 feet away and crouched, watching me with those human eyes, waiting. Others joined it. They appeared from the trees in ones and twos until I counted 6 of them arrayed across the slope below me. All were similar in their horrifying construction, too thin, too tall, that same gray skin and patchy hair, but each was slightly different in detail. Some were taller, some had longer limbs, some had more teeth visible in their gaping mouths. They didn't attack, just formed a loose semicircle and watched me with inhuman patience. Minutes passed. The creatures occasionally looked at each other, that clicking communication passing between them, but they made no move toward me. I couldn't understand what they were waiting for. If they wanted to kill me, they had me cornered, 6 against 1, and they were faster, stronger, better equipped for violence with those claws and teeth. So why did they just stand there? The answer came from above. I heard the scraping sound of claws on rock and looked up to see another creature descending the cliff face with spider-like agility. This one was different from the others, larger, with broader shoulders and darker coloring. As it climbed down toward me, I saw that it wore something around its neck, a cord threaded with what looked like small bones and teeth, some kind of ornament or marking of status. The creature dropped the last few feet and landed heavily on the slope above me. Up close, I could see the individual muscles moving under its skin, could smell the rot on its breath when it exhaled. This close, I could also see the intelligence in its eyes, not just animal cunning, but genuine cognition. It was thinking, planning, considering. It reached toward me slowly, clawed hand extended. I slashed at it with my knife, a wild defensive swing that had no chance of landing. The creature pulled its hand back easily, then made that rumbling sound I'd heard in the cabin. Not aggressive, almost conversational. It pointed at me, then at its own chest, then back to me. I didn't understand. Or maybe I didn't want to understand. The creature tried again, the same sequence of gestures, adding a beckoning motion. It wanted me to come with them, voluntarily. The thought sent a spike of revulsion through me so strong I nearly vomited. "No," I said, my voice hoarse and cracking. "No, stay back. Stay away from me." The creature's head tilted. It looked down at the others below, then back to me. It made a series of clicking sounds, and the others responded. I had the terrible impression of a conversation happening, a debate or discussion about what to do with me. One of the creatures below made an aggressive gesture, lunging forward a few steps, but the larger one above me hissed sharply and it backed down. I was watching this interaction, trying to understand the hierarchy and dynamics, when I noticed the smell. It had been present since the clearing, but I'd been too focused on survival to fully register it. Now, pressed against the cliff with nowhere to run, I couldn't ignore it. The creatures reeked of decay, but beneath that was something else, something that triggered a deep, primal recognition in the most ancient parts of my brain. They smelled like winter, like starvation, like the desperate hunger of the dying season when food grows scarce and the weak perish in the cold. The smell wasn't just physical but somehow emotional, a psychic assault that made me feel hollow and weak, as if my own body was beginning to consume itself from the inside out. The large creature reached for me again, more insistently this time. Its claws clicked together in what might have been agitation or emphasis. The others below had begun to move, climbing slowly up the slope, closing the distance. They were done waiting, I realized. Whatever decision they'd reached, the time for action had come. I looked up at the cliff above me. The rock face was steep but not entirely smooth. I could see cracks and ledges, places where fingers and toes might find purchase. It would be a desperate climb, probably impossible, but the alternative was to let them take me. I thought of the clearing full of bones, the methodical arrangement of remains, whatever they wanted me for. It wasn't going to end with a quick death. I sheathed my knife and started climbing. The rock was cold and damp under my fingers. My first few handholds were solid, and I hauled myself up several feet before my boot slipped on a patch of moss. I caught myself, heart hammering, and looked down to see the creatures watching with what seemed like curiosity. They made no move to follow, not yet. I climbed higher, finding a rhythm despite my shaking limbs. The pack on my back threw off my balance, and I briefly considered cutting it loose, but it was the only barrier between my back and the creatures if they decided to pursue. 10 feet up, 15. The creatures below began to move, but not climbing. They were spreading out along the base of the cliff, positioning themselves to catch me if I fell. My hand found a deep crack, and I wedged my fingers inside, using it to pull myself over a small overhang. The motion put me temporarily out of sight of the creatures below, and in that moment of obscured vision, I heard the large one make a sharp, commanding sound. They came up the cliff after me like a swarm of massive, skeletal spiders. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I climbed with reckless abandon, no longer carefully testing each hold but simply grabbing and pulling, trusting momentum to carry me upward. Below me, I could hear the scrape of claws on stone, hear their clicking communication growing more urgent. They were faster than me, more adapted to this kind of movement, but I had desperation on my side and a head start that I was determined to maintain. My hand found the edge of a ledge and I hauled myself over it, rolling onto a flat space barely 3 feet wide. I had no time to rest. A clawed hand appeared over the edge where I'd just climbed, and I kicked at it reflexively. My boot connected with something solid, and I heard a sharp hiss, the hand disappearing. But 2 more appeared immediately, one on each side of me, and I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit rock. A dead end. The ledge ended in a shallow alcove where erosion had eaten into the softer stone. I was trapped again, 30 feet above the ground, with monsters coming up behind me. I pulled my knife out and brandished it uselessly, knowing it would make no difference but unable to simply surrender without any resistance at all. The large creature pulled itself over the edge of the ledge, and in the confined space it seemed even more enormous. Its head nearly brushed the overhang above us. Behind it, I could see others climbing, their gray forms moving up the cliff face in a grotesque parody of human motion. The large one advanced on me slowly, backing me deeper into the alcove until I could retreat no further. It crouched down to my level, and being this close to its face was almost more than I could bear. The skin was cracked and dry in places, weeping clear fluid in others. The teeth, I could now see, were stained and broken in places, but still wickedly sharp. Those human eyes stared into mine with an intensity that made me feel dizzy. Then it spoke, not in the clicking language it used with the others, but in English, broken and distorted by a throat and mouth not meant for human speech, but unmistakably English nonetheless. "Come," it said, the words stretched and twisted. "Come, with us." My mind reeled. It spoke. It knew language. These weren't just animals or even clever beasts. They were people, or had been, or were something in between that defied easy categorization. The implications crashed through my consciousness like falling rocks, shattering every assumption I'd been desperately clinging to. "What are you?" I whispered. The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Hungry," it said. "Always. Hungry. You will understand." "I won't go with you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't." The creature tilted its head, and something like sadness flickered across those 2 human eyes. "Not choice," it said. "Not anymore. Winter comes. The hunger comes. You will join, or you will feed." Other creatures had reached the ledge now, pulling themselves up to flank their apparent leader. I was surrounded, pressed into the alcove with nowhere to go but down. The large creature reached for me again, and this time I didn't pull away. Not because I'd given up, but because I'd made a decision. When its hand closed around my arm, I drove my knife into its wrist with every ounce of strength I possessed. The blade sank deep, grinding against bone. The creature shrieked, a sound so loud in the confined space that I felt my eardrums compress. It jerked backward, pulling me with it, and we tumbled together off the ledge. We fell in a tangle of limbs, the creature's other hand scrabbling at me, trying to grab hold even as we plummeted. I heard screaming, maybe mine, maybe the creatures, maybe both, and then we hit the slope below in an explosion of pain. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs and sent us rolling, bouncing off rocks and sliding through loose soil. The creature's grip on me broke and we separated, tumbling in different directions. I came to rest against a tree trunk, the impact stunning me into momentary immobility. Every part of my body hurt. I tasted blood in my mouth and couldn't tell if I'd bitten my tongue or suffered worse internal injuries. But I was alive, and I was alone. I forced myself to move, to push through the pain and the shock. My pack had torn free during the fall and lay several yards away, but I couldn't risk retrieving it. Above me on the cliff face, the other creatures were descending rapidly, their movements frantic and aggressive now that I'd harmed one of their own. I could see the large one struggling to its feet where it had landed, dark fluid blood that looked almost black dripping from its wounded wrist. I ran on legs that threatened to buckle with every step, my vision swimming and my breath coming in pained gasps. Something was broken inside me, ribs maybe, or something worse, but I forced myself to keep moving. The forest swallowed me and I crashed through undergrowth that tore at my already lacerated skin. Behind me, the creatures howled, the sound different now, angry and vengeful rather than merely predatory. I have no clear memory of the next several hours. Pain and fear blurred everything into a nightmare collage of trees and rocks and my own labored breathing. I fell more times than I could count, getting up each time only through some animal instinct that refused to let me die lying down. The sounds of pursuit faded, then returned, then faded again as I staggered through terrain that rose and fell in punishing waves. At some point late afternoon, based on the angle of the light, I stumbled into a stream and fell face first into the water. The cold shocked me back to something resembling consciousness. I rolled onto my back, staring up at the canopy spinning slowly above me, and seriously considered just staying there, letting the water and exhaustion take me. It would be easier than continuing this futile flight. But I didn't. Some stubborn core of survival drove me to sit up, to cup water in my shaking hands and drink, to splash the blood from my face and assess my injuries. I was in bad shape, probably concussed, definitely suffering from broken ribs, and showing signs of internal bleeding based on the pain in my abdomen. But I could still move, and where there was movement, there was hope. I followed the stream downhill, reasoning that water always led somewhere, eventually reaching larger bodies of water that meant civilization. The terrain grew easier as I descended, the forest opening up into more mature stands of trees with less undergrowth. I saw signs of human activity, an old trail marker, mostly obscured by moss, and later a rusted tin can wedged into the roots of a tree. People had been here once. Maybe they still came here, occasionally. The stream joined a larger creek, and the creek eventually fed into a river. By the time I reached the river, the sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and red that seemed almost obscenely beautiful after the horrors of the day. I followed the riverbank, and just as full darkness fell, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life. Lights, electric lights, the harsh white glow of industrial fixtures, and beneath them, a bridge, a real road bridge with asphalt and steel railings. The river I'd followed had led me to civilization. I don't remember climbing up to the road. The next clear memory I have is lying on the pavement while headlights illuminated me and voices shouted questions I couldn't comprehend. Someone wrapped me in a blanket. Someone else pressed something soft against my head where blood was flowing freely from a cut I hadn't known was there. There were sirens in the distance, growing closer. "What happened to you?" someone asked, their face swimming in and out of focus above me. "Were you in an accident? What were you doing out there?" I opened my mouth to answer, to tell them about the cabin and the creatures and the feeding ground full of bones. But when I tried to form the words, nothing came out. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make them understand that there were things in those mountains that shouldn't exist? That the old stories and legends weren't just superstition but terrible truth? "Fell," I finally managed to croak. "Got lost. Fell." They seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least knew better than to press someone in my condition for details. The ambulance arrived and hands lifted me onto a stretcher. As they loaded me into the vehicle, I caught a glimpse of the forest beyond the road's edge. The trees stood dark and imposing, their shadows deep and impenetrable. And in those shadows, I thought I saw movement. Tall, thin shapes that stood too still to be trees swaying in the wind. Watching, waiting. I closed my eyes and didn't open them again until the ambulance doors shut, cutting off my view of the forest. That was 3 months ago. I'm told I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from my injuries, 3 broken ribs, a moderate concussion, significant bruising and lacerations, and internal bleeding that required surgery to repair. I told the authorities I'd fallen down a slope while lost, and they seemed to accept that explanation. They found my pack, or what was left of it, about a mile from where I'd emerged. The contents were scattered and partially destroyed, though interestingly, nothing was missing. Whatever the creatures had been doing with it, scavenging wasn't their purpose. They searched for the cabin I described, but found nothing. The coordinates I gave them, extrapolated from my GPS data, pointed to a stretch of particularly dense wilderness where no structures were evident on satellite imagery. My map, which I'd left in the cabin, was gone. No evidence remained of my passage through that haunted hollow except for my injuries and my increasingly fragmented memories. I've tried to research what I encountered. The term Wendigo appears in various indigenous traditions, describing creatures that were once human but became something else through starvation and cannibalism. The legends speak of insatiable hunger, of victims who transform into monsters. Some stories describe them as solitary, others as forming hunting packs. The details vary between tribes and regions, but certain elements remain consistent: the unnatural thinness, the hunger that can never be satisfied, and the terrible intelligence that persists despite the physical transformation. But academic research and folklore archives feel inadequate to describe what I experienced. Those creatures weren't legends or metaphors for human evil. They were real, solid, conscious beings that existed in those mountains long before I stumbled into their territory. They organized and communicated. They maintained feeding grounds and territorial boundaries. They tried to recruit me, or convert me, or whatever that large one was attempting when it asked me to come with them. The worst part, the thing that keeps me awake at night even now, is the hunger. I've felt it since I left those mountains, a gnawing emptiness that food doesn't satisfy. My appetite has increased dramatically. I eat twice what I used to, yet I never feel full. I wake in the night with cramping pains in my stomach, dreaming of meat and bone marrow and things I can't consciously acknowledge craving. The doctors say it's psychological, trauma manifesting as disordered eating. They've recommended therapy, which I've been attending dutifully. I don't tell my therapist about the hunger, though. I don't tell anyone about that. Some things are too dangerous to say aloud, as if speaking them might make them more real, might accelerate whatever process began when that creature grabbed my arm and its blood mixed with mine on that mountainside. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and steel and the comforting noise of human civilization. I avoid forests. I avoid anywhere too isolated or too quiet. And on winter nights, when the temperature drops and the wind howls between the buildings like a pack of predators, I lock my doors and windows and pray that the hunger will leave me alone, that it won't get worse, that I won't wake one morning to find my reflection showing eyes that have become too human, staring back at me from a face that's becoming something else entirely. The Appalachian Mountains are vast, covering territory across multiple states, containing thousands of square miles of wilderness that humans rarely visit. In those deep places, far from trails and campgrounds, things persist, things that perhaps were human once, or are human still in some terrible, transformed way. They watch the boundaries of their territory and wait for the lost and the foolish to stumble into their domain. And in the hunger of winter, when game grows scarce and desperation sets in, they come down from the high places and hunt. I know this now. I survived my encounter, but I'm not sure I escaped. The hunger grows stronger each day, and I find myself thinking about those mountains more and more, about that cabin in the hollow, about the creatures who spoke and watched with human eyes and invited me to join them in their endless, aching need. Some nights, I almost want to go back. The mountain fog rolled in thick that October evening, turning the world beyond my headlights into a wall of gray cotton. I'd been driving these Appalachian backroads for 3 hours, trying to find the old fire tower where I was supposed to meet my camping group. My phone had lost signal 2 towns back, and the hand-drawn map my friend Carter had texted me before I left civilization was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. I should have turned back when I passed through Katanning, the last real town before the wilderness swallowed everything whole. The gas station attendant, an elderly man named Harold, had given me a long, measuring look when I asked about the trails near Shadow Ridge. "You going up there alone?" he'd asked, his weathered hands pausing mid-scan on my beef jerky and bottled water. "Meeting friends," I'd assured him. He'd shaken his head slowly, the fluorescent lights above casting deep shadows in the lines of his face. Folks been seeing things up on Shadow Ridge. Strange things. You be careful now, especially after dark. I'd thanked him with the kind of polite dismissiveness city people reserve for rural superstition, paid for my supplies, and headed back into the mountains. Now, as my car crawled along a road that seemed to be dissolving into forest with each passing mile, I was starting to wish I'd asked him what kind of things. The high beams caught something ahead, not deer, thank God, but a small pull-off area with a weathered wooden sign barely clinging to its post. I stopped and got out, leaving the engine running and the lights on. The sign read, Shadow Ridge Fire Tower, 2.3 miles, with an arrow pointing to a trail that disappeared into the darkness between towering pines and ancient oaks. The air hit me first. It was wrong somehow. October in the Appalachians should smell like wood smoke and fallen leaves, that earthy sweetness of decay and renewal. Instead, there was something else underneath, something acrid and chemical, like ozone after a lightning strike, but sustained, hanging in the air like a threat. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it across the trailhead. The trees here grew differently than they should, their trunks twisted at odd angles, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like grasping fingers. Several of the closer trees had deep gouges in their bark, running vertical for 6 or 7 feet, as if something large had dragged claws down their length. My rational mind supplied explanations. Bears marking territory, maybe. Deer rubbing antlers, natural weathering. But something deeper and older in my brain was screaming at me to get back in the car and drive until I hit pavement and streetlights and the blessed anonymity of civilization. I should have listened. Instead, I shouldered my backpack, locked the car, and started up the trail. The beam of my flashlight seemed smaller than it should, swallowed too quickly by the darkness pressing in from all sides. The trees formed a tunnel overhead, their autumn-bare branches creating patterns against the purple-black sky that looked almost deliberately arranged, like symbols in a language I couldn't quite read. 20 minutes into the hike, I heard the first sound that wasn't my boots on the packed dirt trail. It started as a low hum, almost subsonic, felt more than heard. It made my teeth ache and my stomach turn. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound no animal in these mountains should be able to make. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling as I swept it through the trees. Nothing moved. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that the absence of noise became its own kind of sound. No insects, no birds, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. The forest held its breath. That's when I saw the eyes. They were huge, the size of dinner plates, and they glowed a brilliant crimson red in the darkness about 30 feet off the trail. They were positioned too high to be any animal I knew, at least 8 feet off the ground. As I stared, frozen in place, they blinked. Not the quick flicker of a deer or the slow, lazy descent of an owl's nictitating membrane, but a deliberate, almost mechanical snap of darkness that reminded me somehow of a camera shutter. The thing behind those eyes shifted, and I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark, a silhouette that made no sense against the trees. Wings, enormous wings, unfolded with a sound like old leather stretching. They had to span 15 feet at least, maybe 20. Then it was gone. Not walking away, not flying off through the trees, just gone as if someone had flipped a switch and removed it from reality. I stood there shaking, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, behind my eyes, in my fingertips where they gripped the flashlight. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, but I couldn't make my legs work. It was as if my body understood something my mind was still trying to deny, that running might trigger a chase response from something I absolutely did not want chasing me. When I could finally move again, I did something monumentally stupid. I kept going up the trail. I told myself it was because my friends were at the fire tower, that safety in numbers was just another 2 miles ahead. But the truth was darker than that. Some part of me needed to understand what I'd just seen, needed to know it was real and not some trick of exhaustion and mountain fog. The trail climbed steeper, switchbacking up the side of Shadow Ridge. My flashlight picked out more of those claw marks on the trees, and something else, patches of gray-brown fur caught on rough bark, each tuft as long as my hand. I made myself not touch them, not look too closely, just keep walking with my light pointed ahead and my ears straining for any sound of those wings. I was so focused on what might be behind me or in the trees that I almost missed what was directly in front of me. My boot hit something that wasn't dirt or rock, and I looked down to find a backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It was new, expensive looking, the kind of gear that weekend hikers buy from outdoor stores in the city. One of the straps was torn completely away, the edges ragged as if something had ripped it with tremendous force. I knelt beside it, my flashlight beam revealing a name patch sewn onto the front, Marcus Chen. Inside were all the things someone would pack for a weekend camping trip: a sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, water purifier, first aid kit. Everything except the person who owned it. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from up ahead, multiple voices shouting and overlapping, and I felt a surge of relief, so intense my knees went weak. My friends, other people, safety. I stood up, left Marcus Chen's abandoned backpack where it lay, and hurried up the trail. But as I got closer, the relief curdled into something else. The voices weren't right. They were too loud, too sharp, echoing off the mountain in ways that made the words unintelligible. And underneath them, I could hear that humming sound again, rising and falling like a heartbeat made of sound. I came around the last bend in the trail and stopped dead. The fire tower loomed ahead, a skeletal metal structure rising 70 feet into the darkness. But it wasn't empty. There were people at the base, 6 or 7 figures standing in a loose circle, their flashlights pointed up at the observation deck at the top of the tower. And perched on the railing of that deck, silhouetted against the night sky, was something with wings. "Don't move," a voice hissed from somewhere to my left, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A hand grabbed my arm and pulled me off the trail, behind a massive oak tree. My flashlight swung wildly before someone else caught my wrist and forced it down, covering the beam with their palm. "Kill the light," the first voice whispered urgently. "It can see us better when we shine lights at it." I fumbled with the switch, plunging us into darkness. Gradually my eyes adjusted, helped by the faint glow of the moon struggling through the fog. I could make out 3 people crouched around me, 2 men and a woman, all wearing hiking gear, all looking absolutely terrified. "I'm Dylan," the one who'd grabbed me said. He was maybe 30, with a scraggly beard and wild eyes. "This is Emma and Nathaniel. You shouldn't have come up here." "I was supposed to meet my friends at the tower," I managed, my voice shaking. "Carter and his group. Have you seen them?" Emma shook her head. She was younger, maybe early 20s, with her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had mostly come undone. "We haven't seen anyone else since that thing arrived." "How long ago did they say they'd be here?" "They were supposed to set up camp this afternoon." The 3 of them exchanged looks that made my stomach drop. Nathaniel, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose, spoke for the first time. "We got here around 4 o'clock. The tower was empty then. The observation deck had signs of recent use food wrappers, water bottles, but no people. We were setting up our tents in the clearing when it showed up." "What is it?" I asked, even though some part of me already knew. Harold's warning at the gas station echoed in my mind. "Folks been seeing things up on Shadow Ridge." "We don't know," Emma said, "but it won't let us leave. Every time we try to head down the trail, it swoops down and drives us back. 2 people in our group tried to make a run for it about an hour ago. It caught them both before they made it 50 feet. "Caught them?" My mouth had gone dry. "What do you mean?" "Caught them." Dylan's face had gone pale. "It picked them up, just reached down with these massive claws and lifted them right off the ground. They were screaming, and then it dropped them into the trees. We heard them hit the ground, heard them thrashing around in the brush, and then nothing. Complete silence. I thought of Marcus Chen's abandoned backpack, of the torn strap and the missing owner. We have to call for help. Someone must have cell service." "No signal," Nathaniel interrupted. "We've all tried. It's like there's some kind of interference. Our phones won't even turn on properly. The screens glitch out, show these weird patterns, then die even though the battery should be full." I pulled out my own phone, but he was right. The screen flickered when I pressed the power button, displayed what looked like static or snow, then went black. The hair on my arms stood up. Phones didn't just stop working like that. Not all of them at once. "The others at the tower," I said, pointing through the trees at the group I'd seen. "Why aren't they hiding like us?" "Because they're not people," Emma said flatly. "Not anymore." I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Dylan leaned forward, his breath coming in short, anxious gasps. "Watch them. Really watch them. They've been standing in that same circle for 2 hours now, shining their flashlights up at that thing, not talking, barely moving. At first we thought they were frozen with fear, like us. But then Nathaniel noticed they're not breathing right. Their chests don't move the way they should, and their eyes." He trailed off, and Emma picked up the thread. "Their eyes glow red when the moonlight hits them at certain angles. Like that thing's eyes. We think it's done something to them, put them under some kind of control." I wanted to tell them they were crazy, that shock and fear were making them see things that weren't there. but I'd seen those enormous red eyes in the forest. I'd heard that inhuman shriek. And now, as I studied the figures standing at the base of the tower, I realized they were right. The stillness was wrong. Humans didn't stand that still, didn't hold that perfect of a formation. Even in the faint light, I could see that their movements, when they came, were jerky and mechanical, like puppets being pulled by amateur strings. "How long has it been watching you?" I asked. "Since sunset," Nathaniel said. "The moment the sun went down, it appeared. 1 second the tower was empty. The next that thing was perched on the railing like it had been there all along. Those people, or whatever they are now, they came stumbling out of the woods about 20 minutes later. We think they might be the ones who left those food wrappers on the observation deck. The ones who were here before us." "Before us," I repeated slowly. "You mean there have been other groups? This has happened before?" "The ranger station in Katanning has been closed for 3 weeks, Emma said. "We only found that out when we got to town. The woman at the diner said there had been incidents up in the Shadow Ridge area. Hikers going missing. Search parties finding abandoned campsites with all the gear intact but no sign of the people. She tried to tell us not to come up here, but we thought she was just being dramatic. Trying to scare the city, folks." I remembered Harold at the gas station. His warning delivered with that serious, measuring look. How many people had he tried to warn? How many had brushed him off, just like I had? A sound echoed across the clearing, that same shriek I'd heard on the trail, but sustained longer, modulating in tone like some kind of alien language. The figures at the base of the tower responded, their heads snapping up in perfect unison to stare at the creature on the observation deck. Their mouths opened, and they made sounds in response, but the sounds were wrong, too high-pitched and staticky, like old radio interference. "They're communicating," Nathaniel whispered, his face gone gray. "It's talking to them, and they're answering. That's not possible. People can't make sounds like that." But they were. As we watched, hidden behind our tree, the possessed hikers began to move. They spread out from the tower in a precise pattern, heading toward the tree line in different directions. Searching. Their flashlights swept through the forest in coordinated arcs, and I realized with growing horror that they were hunting. They were hunting us. "We need to move," Dylan said urgently. "They're going to find us if we stay here." "Move where?" Emma's voice cracked with barely suppressed panic. "That thing is watching from the tower. It can see the whole clearing, probably most of the forest around here. The second we break cover, we go deeper into the woods," I said, surprising myself. "We can't go down the trail because that thing will catch us. We can't stay here because those people will find us. So we go sideways, work our way around the mountain, put some distance between us and the tower, then try to find another way down." It was a terrible plan. Going off trail in the Appalachians at night was a recipe for getting lost, injured, or killed. The terrain was treacherous even in daylight: steep slopes, hidden ravines, deadfalls, and rock slides waiting to break an ankle or crack a skull. But staying here meant either being found by the possessed hikers or eventually being picked off by the thing on the tower. "He's right," Nathaniel said. "It's our only chance." We moved as quietly as we could, staying low and keeping the massive oak trunks between us and the clearing. Behind us, I could hear the possessed hikers spreading out, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights at a prison. The forest seemed to grow denser as we moved away from the trail, the undergrowth grabbing at our clothes and boots. Thorny vines caught my jacket, and I had to stop to carefully untangle myself, every second of delay making my heart pound harder. Emma was in front of me, and I could see her shoulders shaking, whether from fear or cold or both. I couldn't tell. We'd gone maybe 200 yards when the shrieking started again, but this time it was different. Closer. Moving. I looked back and caught a glimpse of something massive passing between the trees, blocking out the faint moonlight. Wings. The thing had left the tower and was hunting. "Run," Dylan hissed, and we did. Running through a forest at night is an exercise in controlled panic. Every step could be your last before you hit a hidden root, a loose rock, a steep drop-off into nothing. The darkness plays tricks, making shadows look solid and solid things look like shadows. Branches whip your face. Thorns tear at exposed skin. Your breath comes in ragged gasps that seem loud enough to wake the dead. But none of that mattered because behind us, something much worse than the forest was coming. I could hear it moving through the canopy, the leathery sound of those enormous wings beating the air, sending dead leaves and small branches raining down. The shrieking had changed too, becoming more focused, more directional. It knew where we were. It was tracking us. Emma stumbled and went down hard, her hands hitting the ground with a wet slap in a patch of mud. I grabbed her arm and hauled her up, and we kept moving, following Nathaniel's dark shape as he dodged between trees. Dylan brought up the rear, occasionally looking back and letting out small, terrified whimpers. The slope suddenly got steeper, and we half ran, half slid down it, grabbing at saplings and exposed roots to keep from tumbling end over end. Loose rocks scattered under our feet, clattering down the mountainside and announcing our position to anything listening. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow ravine, with steep walls on either side and a thin stream running through it. "This way," Nathaniel gasped, pointing downstream. "Maybe we can lose it in the water. Dogs can't track scents through water, right?" "That's not a dog," Emma said. But we followed him anyway because what else could we do? The stream was shallow but treacherously rocky. We waded through it, the ice-cold water soaking our boots and making our feet go numb. The ravine walls rose 15 or 20 feet on either side, close enough that I could almost touch both at once. It felt like being in a tomb, or a throat, somewhere we weren't meant to be. We'd gone maybe 50 yards when the shrieking stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. We froze, water rushing around our ankles, our ragged breathing the only sound. I tilted my head back and looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the ravine walls. 2 enormous red eyes stared back at me. "Move!" I shouted, and we scattered just as something huge and dark dropped into the ravine behind us. I got a clear look at it for the first time, and my mind tried to reject what I was seeing. It was shaped roughly like a man, but too tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more, with arms that hung too long and ended in hands tipped with curved talons. The wings sprouted from its back, attached to shoulder joints that looked too large, too pronounced, but it was the face that made me want to scream. It was almost human, with recognizable features, eyes, a nose, a mouth, but all of it was wrong, angular and sharp, like someone had drawn a human face from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off in every dimension. And those eyes, those massive, glowing red eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me, seeing something deeper than flesh and bone. It shrieked again, and the sound in the enclosed space of the ravine was physically painful. I clapped my hands over my ears and kept running, following the others downstream. The thing pursued, moving with a strange, loping gait that covered ground faster than any human sprint. Its wings were folded tight against its back to fit in the narrow space, but I could see them twitching, preparing to spread if it got room. Dylan made the mistake of looking back. His foot caught on a submerged rock, and he went down face first in the stream. The creature was on him in an instant, those huge hands reaching down and grabbing him by the shoulders. Dylan screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly as the thing lifted him effortlessly into the air. For a moment they were both silhouetted against the sky, Dylan's legs kicking wildly, his arms flailing. Then the creature's eyes flared brighter, and Dylan went rigid. His screaming stopped. His struggling stopped. He hung there in the thing's grip like a doll, and when it set him back down on his feet in the stream, he stood perfectly still, his head turned toward us with that same mechanical precision we'd seen in the possessed hikers. His eyes glowed red. "Dylan?" Emma called out, her voice breaking. "Dylan, please." But Dylan just tilted his head and opened his mouth. What came out wasn't words or a human voice. It was that same staticky interference sound, that alien communication. He was talking to the creature, or the creature was talking through him. Nathaniel grabbed both of us and pulled us backward. "He's gone. We have to go. Now." We fled deeper into the ravine, leaving Dylan standing motionless in the stream with that thing looming over him. Tears were streaming down Emma's face, and I could feel my own cheeks wet, though I didn't remember crying. The horror of what we'd just seen, of what had been done to Dylan, was too big to process while we were still in danger. The ravine eventually widened and climbed back up to forest level. We scrambled up the slope, our hands scrabbling for purchase in loose soil and dead leaves. At the top, we found ourselves on more level ground, in an area of old-growth forest where the trees were huge and ancient, their trunks wider than cars. "We need to hide," Emma panted. "Find somewhere defensible. I can't keep running." Nathaniel was bent over, hands on his knees, sucking in great gasps of air. "There," he managed, pointing. "That fallen tree. We can get under it." It was a massive oak that had toppled years ago, its huge root ball pulled up from the earth to create a hole 10 feet across. The trunk had fallen at an angle, propped up by other trees, creating a space underneath just big enough for people to crawl into. It wouldn't protect us if that thing decided to dig us out, but it was concealment at least. We crawled into the hollow under the trunk, pulling dead leaves and branches over the opening to camouflage it. The space was cramped and smelled of rot and earth. Tree roots hung down around us like the bars of a cage. We huddled together in the darkness, trying to quiet our breathing, trying not to think about Dylan's glowing red eyes. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Time had lost meaning. We could hear sounds outside, footsteps, branches breaking, that staticky communication. They were searching for us. The possessed hikers had been joined by Dylan, and probably others we didn't know about. An army of human puppets, controlled by something that shouldn't exist. "Why is it doing this?" Emma whispered. "What does it want?" Nathaniel adjusted his glasses with shaking hands. Every culture has stories of creatures like this. Things that watch from the darkness, that steal people away, that corrupt and control. The Mothman, they call it in Point Pleasant. Giant bird with red eyes that appears before disasters. Maybe that's what this is. "This isn't Point Pleasant," I said. "This is Shadow Ridge. Has this thing been here all along? Has it been taking people for years?" "The closed ranger station," Emma said slowly. "The abandoned campsites. How long has this been going on? How many people has it taken?" We fell silent, contemplating that horrible possibility. How many hikers had come up into these mountains and never come back? How many were now wandering these forests with glowing red eyes, calling to their former companions in voices made of static? A sound directly above us made us all freeze. Footsteps on the fallen tree trunk. Slow, measured steps accompanied by that horrible staticky speech. One of the possessed ones was standing right above where we hid, separated from us by 2 feet of wood and bark. Emma's hand found mine in the darkness and squeezed so hard I thought my bones might break. We didn't breathe, didn't move, barely even thought. The footsteps moved along the trunk, paused, moved back. The thing above us knew we were close. It just couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Then another sound joined it, the leathery beating of wings. The creature itself had arrived. Through tiny gaps in the leaves covering our hiding spot, I could see movement in the forest outside. Dark shapes circling, red eyes scanning. They were so close I could smell them, that acrid, ozone-like scent I'd noticed at the trailhead. But stronger now, almost overwhelming. The possessed hiker on the tree trunk above us spoke again, that alien chittering sound. The creature responded, its shriek lower and more controlled this time, almost conversational. They were communicating, coordinating. The thing was directing its puppets to search more thoroughly. We couldn't stay here. Eventually they'd find us, and then we'd either be caught like Dylan or killed like whoever had owned Marcus Chen's backpack. We needed a plan, not just hiding and hoping. I leaned close to Nathaniel's ear and breathed more than whispered. "We have to split up, draw them different directions." He shook his head violently, but I grabbed his shoulder. "It's our only chance. If we all stay together, we're one target. But if we separate, maybe one of us makes it down the mountain, gets help, tells people what's happening up here." Emma heard and nodded slowly, tears still tracking through the dirt on her face. "He's right. Someone has to survive to warn others." "On 3, I mouthed. "Different directions. Run as fast as you can." I counted down on my fingers. 3, 2, 1. We exploded out of our hiding place in 3 different directions, scattering dead leaves and branches. For a moment, the possessed ones were caught off guard, their coordination broken by our sudden movement. That moment was all we had. I ran north, or at least what I thought was north, crashing through undergrowth with no concern for stealth anymore. Behind me, I could hear Emma and Nathaniel doing the same, their footsteps fading as they took their own paths through the forest. I could also hear the shrieking multiple shrieks now, layered over each other, as if the creature was somehow tracking all 3 of us at once. The forest became a blur of dark trunks and grasping branches. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I kept running, because stopping meant being caught, and being caught meant those glowing red eyes, that alien control, that loss of self that was worse than death. I don't know how long I ran. Time had become meaningless, stretched and compressed by adrenaline and terror. Eventually the trees started to thin, and I realized with a surge of desperate hope that I was going downhill, really downhill, leaving the high peaks of Shadow Ridge behind. Maybe I could make it. Maybe I could actually escape this nightmare and get help. That's when I ran straight into a chain-link fence. The impact knocked me backward onto the ground, stars exploding across my vision. I lay there stunned for several seconds before my brain caught up with what I'd just hit. A fence. Out here in the middle of nowhere, stretching left and right as far as I could see through the trees. It was old, maybe 20 feet high, with rusted links and weathered posts, but solid enough to stop me cold. Warning signs were attached at regular intervals. Danger, no trespassing, U.S. government property. Below that, in smaller text, use of deadly force authorized. I pulled myself up using the fence and stared at the signs. What was the government doing out here in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness, and why fence it off so extensively? The fence extended in both directions farther than I could see, and though the posts were old, the fence itself looked recently maintained. Behind me, I could hear crashing through the underbrush. They were coming. The possessed hikers, probably that thing with them. I had seconds to make a decision. The fence was high, but I'd climbed worse. I jumped up, my fingers finding purchase in the chain link, and started climbing. The old metal cut into my hands and my feet kept slipping, but pure terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. Up and up, the top seeming to recede as I climbed, my arms screaming with effort. I was almost to the top when I heard Emma scream. The sound came from somewhere off to my left, cut through the forest like a knife through flesh. It started as a cry of fear but ended in that horrible staticky sound we'd heard from Dylan and the others. She'd been caught, converted, added to the creature's army of puppets. My hands almost slipped off the fence. Emma was gone. Dylan was gone. How many others? Was I the only one left? Keep climbing, I told myself through gritted teeth. Just keep climbing. I reached the top of the fence, swung my leg over the curved bar at the apex, and dropped down the other side. The fall was longer than I expected, and I hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Something in my ankle twisted painfully, but I forced myself to stand and keep moving. This side of the fence looked different. The trees were marked with old paint blazes, and there were the remains of buildings scattered through the forest, concrete foundations overrun with vegetation, collapsed structures that might once have been barracks or storage facilities. Whatever this place had been, it was old, abandoned for decades probably. But the fence was maintained, which meant someone was still paying attention to it, which meant maybe there was a way to call for help. I limped through the ruins, trying to stay low and quiet. The creature couldn't have crossed the fence, those wings were too large. But the possessed hikers might climb it, might already be climbing it. I needed to find shelter, find a way to contact the outside world, find something. That's when I saw the bunker. It was built into the side of a small hill, a massive steel door set into concrete walls that looked like they could withstand anything. The door was partially open, just a few inches, but open. Without thinking about what might be inside, I squeezed through the gap and into the darkness beyond. The air inside was cool and dry, with that peculiar smell of sealed spaces, concrete, dust, and metal, and something else I couldn't identify. I pulled out my phone, hoping against hope that it might work now that I was behind government fencing, away from that creature's influence. The screen flickered, showed static, then suddenly blazed to life. Full bars. I almost cried with relief, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice sounded like it was coming from another universe, normal and calm and completely disconnected from the horror I'd just survived. My name is Topped. Would telling them my name make this real? Would it make this something I could never escape? There's something on Shadow Ridge, in the Appalachian Mountains near Katanning. It's killing people, taking people. You have to send help. Slow down, sir. You said Shadow Ridge? That area has been closed to the public. How did you? Please. I was begging now, too exhausted to be ashamed. My friends are dead or worse. There's a creature up there, and it's controlling people, making them into puppets. And, sir, I'm going to connect you to the Park Service. Stay on the line. There was a click, then another voice. This one male and official sounding. This is Ranger Command. You say you're on Shadow Ridge? We need your exact location. I'm inside some kind of bunker. There's a fence, government property signs. What is this place? A long pause. Sir, you've entered a restricted area. Old military installation. We need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't leave the bunker. Do you understand? Do not leave the bunker under any circumstances. We're sending a team to extract you. What about my friends? There are people up there, possessed or controlled or something. And the creature, we know about the creature. The ranger's voice had gone flat, emotionless. We've been tracking it for 3 weeks. That's why we closed the area. You and your friends shouldn't have been up there. Stay in the bunker. We'll be there within the hour. The call ended. I stood there in the darkness, my mind reeling. They knew. The rangers, the government. Someone knew about that thing, and they'd been tracking it. The closed ranger station, the warnings from the locals, it hadn't been superstition or coincidence. There was a reason Shadow Ridge had been off limits. I sank down against the concrete wall, my injured ankle throbbing, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. The bunker stretched away into darkness ahead of me, and I wondered what secrets this place held, what the government had been doing out here that required 20-foot fences and deadly force warnings. Outside, I could hear sounds, footsteps, that staticky speech. They'd followed me over the fence. The possessed ones were searching the old military installation, looking for me. I pressed myself against the wall and tried to be as quiet as possible, barely breathing. Red light flickered at the bunker entrance. They were checking inside. I heard footsteps on concrete, getting closer. Then that voice, Emma's voice, but wrong, layered with static and that alien quality calling my name. Not the way Emma would say it, but mechanical, questioning, like it was testing the sound. I closed my eyes and prayed she wouldn't find me. Prayed the rescue team would arrive in time. Prayed that someone, somewhere, could stop what was happening on Shadow Ridge before more people were taken. The footsteps got closer, stopped. I heard breathing, if you could call it that, more like air being pulled through a damaged speaker. Then, from outside, a new sound. Helicopters. Multiple helicopters, coming in fast and low. Bright lights suddenly flooded through the bunker entrance, and I heard shouting, orders being barked in military cadence. The possessed Emma turned and walked back toward the entrance. Through slitted eyes, I watched her silhouette against the lights. She stepped outside, and immediately there were gunshots, not regular gunfire, but something else, deeper and more resonant. Tranquilizer rounds, maybe. I stayed frozen against the wall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, a voice called into the bunker. If anyone's in there, you need to come out now. This is the U.S. Forest Service working with National Guard. You're safe. The area is secure. I didn't believe it was safe. I might never believe anywhere was safe again. But I limped toward the entrance anyway, because what choice did I have? Outside, Shadow Ridge was lit up like a football stadium. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights turning night into day. Military vehicles were scattered through the old installation, and soldiers in full gear were everywhere. I could see bodies, the possessed hikers lying still on the ground, tagged and being loaded onto stretchers. A ranger approached me, his face grave. You're lucky to be alive. How many were in your group? There were supposed to be 5 of us meeting at the fire tower, I said, but Carter and the others never showed up. Then I found 3 more people, Dylan, Emma, and Nathaniel. The thing got Dylan first, then Emma. I don't know about Nathaniel. The ranger made notes on a tablet. We've recovered 7 individuals in various states of possession. The influence seems to fade once the primary entity is contained. Contained? You caught it? He wouldn't meet my eyes. We've been trying for weeks. It's not like anything we've encountered before. Tonight was the first time we got close enough to successfully tranquilize it. Even then, it took enough sedative to drop an elephant, and we're not sure how long it will remain unconscious. What is it? I asked. What is that thing? The ranger hesitated, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. Finally, he said, we're calling it a cryptid for lack of a better term. It showed up about a month ago. Before that, this area was completely safe. No incidents, no disappearances. Then it arrived, and everything changed. It seems to be territorial, aggressive, and capable of exerting some kind of influence over human subjects. Beyond that, he shrugged. We're still learning. They loaded me into an ambulance, wrapped me in shock blankets, started an IV to rehydrate me. As they closed the doors, I caught one last glimpse of Shadow Ridge in the spotlight. The fire tower stood skeletal and empty against the sky. The forest looked almost peaceful, but I knew better now. I knew what watched from those trees, what hunted in that darkness. Even sedated and contained, even with military forces surrounding it, the creature from Shadow Ridge was still out there, still real, still waiting. 3 days later, I was released from the hospital with nothing worse than a sprained ankle and some cuts and bruises. Emma and Dylan were in psychiatric care, being treated for what the authorities were calling severe trauma response. Nathaniel was never found. Neither were Carter and his friends. The official story was a gas leak from an old military bunker, causing hallucinations and panic. The media ran with it for a day, then moved on to other news. Shadow Ridge was permanently closed, the fences extended, the warnings updated. As far as the public knew, it was just another piece of restricted government land, nothing special. But I know the truth. I know what lives in those mountains. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I remember those massive red eyes staring down at me from the darkness. I remember Dylan's face going blank as he was converted. I remember Emma's voice calling my name through the static. And I wonder, If the rangers say they contained it, why do I still dream of wings beating in the night? Why do I still hear that shriek echoing in my mind? Why, when I look out my apartment window at the city lights below, do I sometimes see shadows moving that shouldn't be there, shapes that spread two large wings against the urban glow? The Mothman of Shadow Ridge is contained, they tell me. The danger is past. But every instinct I have, every primal fear burned into my DNA by that night in the Appalachians, tells me they're wrong. The creature isn't gone. It's just waiting, watching, gathering its strength for whatever comes next. And I have the terrible feeling that Shadow Ridge was just the beginning.